transactions even through this company. And we've seen this sort of concept of bigger is better. This shows up in wealth differentiation between sort of the highest paid and the lowest paid. And we see as well that in terms of the supply chain, that the people at the top of this chain have very little relationships to what is happening at the bottom of the chain. And it's an extractive relationship. And I think we sit within this framework. And so if we look at the aid industry, the aid sector, I say industry, and that's purposeful because I do believe it is an industry. We look at the aid sector, and I think there's three parts of our story as to why we need this revolution and how I see it happening and within this framework. So the first part is what is specifically making the grand bargain or the concept of localization not work? If we come at it from our sector, the second part being, you know, if you want a revolution, you have to have outside, there has to be sort of some kind of pressure coming at whatever the issue is. And usually, unfortunately, it comes along with some form of violence. And the third and final part of our story for our sector would be, what could it look like if this revolution were to take place? So just to begin with the first part, why is the grand bargain not working? What's gone wrong? And I think we first have to look at the idea of legacy organizations, and we cannot forget, you know, where these organizations came from, which was after the Second World War mainly, and they were in a very certain cultural and historical place in time and a certain type of thinking that led these organizations to be born. And it was very much sort of the West helps other poor people sort of concept. And it's very hard to change that kind of thinking and that kind of culture. And I think we see elements of that remain. Going on from that, these legacy organizations, which are mainly number very few, you know, we know sort of the UN, Save the Children, perhaps, or Oxfam, these are nice organizations, but perhaps we have a good image of them, but they do own most of the money. And they know they don't only get most of the money, but they also control the policies and the thinking around how that money should be spent, which is a massive amount of power. So essentially, it has turned out with these organizations that they're unaccountable, because who are they really accountable to? They're not accountable to the people they serve. So that is being not accountable. If you're accountable back to your own country, your own system, that is different to being accountable to the people you serve. So they're not accountable. They're anti-competitive. They have massive brands. I've mentioned three, and I'm sure you know them. You know, and they take up the entire space. So if you're a new organization, whether from the South or the West or wherever you happen to sit, how would you ever compete for space in this, in the current system, which is not only prohibitive to sort of new Syrian organizations coming up in the face of the Syrian conflict, or perhaps in Bangladesh in the face of the Rohingya crisis. What we see is that this money is already going somewhere else and you cannot compete. So it stops innovation. So we always want to see innovation in every industry, but it's prohibitive. We don't see innovation coming up. And it functions as a cartel because these few organizations have a controlling stake in the industry. So they control the policy, they control the money, and they control the thinking. On top of that, we also look at what does it look like if these organizations sort of come into sort of Nairobi or Jordan, where I was for a while, and you see a massive amount of wealth disparities. So being in Jordan, I saw it mirrored what happens in other places. So you have a crisis and a lot of people fly in, and along with that is this, what I viewed as an excessive lifestyle. It was incredibly elite, and people who flew in on contracts in the current aid sector had a lot of money, you know, and that is very, very different to what you see with what's happening in the crisis. They have an elite lifestyle and they're foreigners. They are outsiders coming in. And on top of that, there was a lot of mental health issues and burnout. So people are also limited in terms of what they can offer, if they're also very highly stressed. And at the end of the day, aid is also highly political. In the first part of our story, why is it prohibitive? Just to remind ourselves to change, is that aid is political, whether we look at how America is supporting abstinence tied to aid, rather than sort of educating about contraceptive, or it's tied to how Europe gives money to Jordan or Turkey or Libya to stop refugees, essentially refugees or economic migrants coming into Europe. So it's political. So these are sort of, I'm sure everybody could think of a few more. It's easy to think of stop. There are good things out there, but these are sort of the major things that are stopping change, I would say. And the final question that I would pose in this first part of our story is aid inherently racist? I think that's a very difficult question to even ask, because so many people in the sector mean well, they're genuine and they mean well, and they want to change the world for it to be a better place. So if you're asking people, are you racist? How do you even have that conversation? Do we just change it then to subconscious bias? I don't know. I can't give you the answer, but I think it's a conversation worth having. So those are the stop things. And I have 2 slides here that we can look at for a bit more information about the statistics and sort of the numbers that who controls the aid space. And I don't know if it's yeah, so we can kind of have a look at that. I think it's more for reference for everybody here, so how much the sector is worth and where it's going. I've actually labeled it an opportunity, because when we get challenges in the business sector, we say it's an opportunity for change. So I've said, this is where we stand, and then we can look at the opportunity. So, and then we have the next slide, which is just the challenges for local organizations, more so about the fact of so many, maybe not this one. This one was my last slide. Yeah, this one, that's fine. Basically, local organizations, if you're small, nobody knows you're there because you cannot be visible, you're drowned in paperwork, nobody trusts you. Whatever the data you give, there's an inherent sort of already systematic bias against local organizations. It's more that you're just not trustworthy. That's how the system is designed. And, I think the industry functions as a bit of a cartel. Okay, so that's it with the slides. I'm just going back to the second part of our story. So what causes, I don't need this slide right now, but what causes revolution, right? Because we have to think, what is the pressure that would bring revolution into the sector, and where is the violence? So I'm going to look at 4 aspects just very briefly. So I think at the moment we cannot think outside climate crisis, and that is definitely huge amounts of pressure and huge amounts of violence, and I think especially violence in the natural world. So we have that as an aspect of coming to revolution. We also have to look at technology, which we can say the revolution is already here, and it's causing massive amounts of change, but we also see through, for example, disinformation, that it is causing violence in terms of attacks on minority groups, especially in Myanmar or India. We see that this disinformation has real impacts on loss of life and rioting and death. So we have violence there as well. And then moving on from that, thirdly, we have most recently the George Floyd and racism, activism, and I suppose riots and demonstrations that are also happening. I think in this one, it's interesting to note that anger was already there before we saw it explode out into violence. So this pressure was building, and now we've got this violence coming in, and we cannot, of course, escape from the idea from looking at the pandemic and what that's doing globally in terms of job loss, but also violence, for example, in terms of women, violence in the home and violence against children, and the incredible amounts of mental health problems that we're facing. And I think if we look at our sector, we are not immune from this. This is part of what's happening in the aid industry sector as well. But we do have all of these pressures coming together, and we're at a point in time where we are looking, I think it could be revolutionary in how we look at the changes in our own sector. And this is my slide with the fist that I would like to see. Revolution can be, of course, bloody and very aggressive. I just thought this was quite a fun image to have, in terms of, because we don't really think of very charity work as being like this, but perhaps this is the push that we need. And this is the sort of frustration and build up and the anger and the emotion to have a revolution in the aid sector. So this brings me to the third part of the story. When I was thinking about revolution in the aid sector, for many, change can be slow if you're working with a secure job. But if you're on the receiving end and you need those services, there is a lot of anger, there is a lot of emotion, and I think many of us are also working a long time.
Argentina.
Hello?
Sorry, Ummul, we're just trying to manage a spammer.
Oh, wow. Okay. So just, where was I? Yeah, so we'd like to see the revolution sort of happening. And so coming back to the final part of the story of revolution in aid, I think we have to look at it in terms of the whole and where we sit within that. And we can have massive amounts of change, and I don't think it's going to come from within the sector, and we discussed why already. Unfortunately, I think there are pushes, but we have to accept that it's not going to come from the sector, so it has to come from somewhere else. So what could it look like if it does happen, and if it could happen? And this brings me to why I'm here and the movement that I'm part of, or the movements. So I think what the revolution will look like in the aid industry, the aid sector, is that it does completely transform, and we will see that what we will have is a network approach that's decentralized, that we have lots of different nodes, so that there is no one culture or organization at the top that is controlling all of these networks. And in terms of these networks and this decentralized approach, we can do that because we have the technology revolution, and we do have robotics and AI, and if we can print proteins, and we can print food, and we can have things like blockchain and decentralized data, we can have a decentralized aid industry. And we also see that there is a groundswell, that this movement, people are looking to do this, and it's not coming from the West, it's coming from other perhaps more affected populations. And this is the movement that I'm part of in terms of United Nonsense, that we are already creating this decentralized platform where decision making is not happening in a hierarchical fashion, and where people can access these resources and actually have control over how money is spent, and direct access to funds, as well as the how of what you do in your own community. We're also looking at, through United Nonsense, that we want a message in every university to young people who are coming into the aid sector and expecting that career job. What really is their role? If they are taking on managerial leadership positions, do they expect to fly out? Do they expect to be in these different communities? And do they expect to be at the top of the ladder? Because that is what has to change. We want to see more local people doing that decision making and being at the top of the hierarchy. And it's also part of a campaign in terms of the overall localization movement, that we want to see these changes happening and actually putting it out there. And we're not waiting for the current sector to do it for us. We are saying, no, there are other ways to do it, and making those innovations happen. Of course, ideally, what the revolution would be is that in Africa or South Asia or Bangladesh, that we don't need international aid anymore. That would probably be the true revolution. And we have seen it happen, for example, in China. And we haven't discussed, for example, what is the role of China in all of this? And I think that's the question we could also look at. Also, the role of global finances. I think we gave something like 530 billion in global remittances, but aid is worth 143 billion, but that it's much more visible and it controls the space. So I think there's also could we revolutionize how we look at finance? Let's not tax remittances. I don't know. But so on that note, I think I will finish my presentation, and thank you so much for listening. And I'd love to take any questions or just any thoughts if anybody has any.
Thank you, Ummul. Emma? Emma, you can, okay. Okay, we just have a small, tiny technical problem. It won't last. Okay. Okay, just to explain, we have some spammer here, and they put some, they make some trouble here, so I have to remove them. So now you cannot unmute your microphone by yourself. Maintenant, les gens ne peuvent pas enlever le mute eux-mêmes. Comme ça, on sera plus embêté par les spammers. Emma,
Okay.
tu peux reprendre la parole.
Yes, thank you very much. Sorry about that. So participants are invited to, as I said, add any questions or remarks that they might have in the chat. In the meantime, I'm wondering if this could be a good time, Guillaume, to look at some of the results of the survey questions, if you have those available. So we have quite an even divide on the first one. So are you actively participating in any movement or networks to change how the aid system works, which is quite interesting, I think, considering we're all in a similar sector. Ummul, you can also speak to these if you'd like. Do you consider it necessary to have a new system of development or adapt the current system?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, actually, because I didn't say, you mentioned in the introduction, I've spent a long time working in the sector, and I worked mainly with the Syrian refugee crisis and in the Middle East. And for me, it felt very black and white. Excuse maybe it felt very black and white that we showed up. So I was working, I would say, part of a Syrian organization where I did feel very much that my role was more administrative. And I did everything from the photocopying to actually running the organization. But we saw that there was when the crisis happened in the Middle East, you did simply see an entire load of foreigners show up in Jordan and drive up the rents and drive up the prices for everything. And they had very little knowledge of the local economy, culture, socio-political reality, and did not speak the language. Few people spoke Arabic, and yet here they were in senior roles. And it does create a perception of what it is like to be in the aid. It's like I thought this was, I've never worked for another organization. I've only worked for my own organization. And I thought it was horrifying and unbelievable. And it's funny how things can become normalized. So when I look at this survey, I would find it really interesting to think about, is it even possible to adapt the current system?
I think that's that's the big question that's being posed in this session, because I think there's two schools of thought on whether you work with what's there from the inside or from the outside. So as being part of an aid agency, for example, how do you create some transformational change to ensure that, for example, funds are really reaching the people on the ground where it's needed, versus and also working, with organizations who can work in complementarity to those larger aid organizations. And then there's the other school of thought that, as you were talking about, Ummul, is much more, I think, revolutionary in its approach. And yeah, so it does beg the question, what needs to happen in order for real change to take place and positive change to take place? And there's obviously going to be many different positions on that. Again, if any of the participants have interesting experiences to share, you're very welcome to. There's an option at the bottom of the screen. If you click on participants, you'll see that you can raise your hand. I think you might have to allow this functionality.
There's an interesting point here where someone, Diana, has said, could you climb up in a big NGO and change the system from inside? What I would say to that is I saw young people come in. So this is over more than a decade. So you see young people come in and they climb the ladder. And what happens is real life. You know, you get a partner, you might want to have children, you know, your ability to work for very low pay at the beginning changes. A lot of people want to buy property or invest in their future. So as the years go on and you climb this ladder, you benefit from that system and your skills become a part of that world. And if you try to extract yourself from it, and these are conversations I've had, is how do you extract, and I think it's in any career actually. So we could go to any career. How do you extract yourself from that one career and use your skills in a different setting? So do you go from aid to business? In the business world, your aid skills may not be looked at as on a par with the business world because it's more sexy to go from business into aid other than the other way around. And people just get tied up in that. So I think it's very difficult, you know, to get out of that. And I think we've all had those conversations. So I would be, yes, you can perhaps affect change from within, but it will be limited and it will not be revolutionary, and it will not take into account that somebody who's 7 years old as a child in a refugee camp will lose 10 years of their life while somebody is trying to figure out how to make those changes happen. We need those changes now. We needed them yesterday. And that's why, from my perspective, I would say we need to scrap what doesn't work and move on. Even if it's unrealistic, I would have that vision.
Thank you for that, Ummul. We also have a question from Indira asking, what sort of activities have you organized in relation with international aid, and do you have any success stories to share, and what are the challenges have you faced?
So I think it's really positive that we have all of this technology available. So we're designing a platform to work with a project and iterating it in Syria, in ex-ISIS territory in Raqqa, and looking at how all decision-making can be decentralized. So it's coming out of place, you don't need people flying in, and putting all the systems in place to make that happen. If you're interested in more what that practically looks like, there is another conversation on that happening tomorrow afternoon about frontline aid. But this platform is a way of solving the situation as opposed to getting frustrated. And it's been very challenging to design and do all the thinking around it. But what was interesting is that we were looking for a platform solution whereby you could feed in and do all the due diligence and governance and funding, but have somebody else use all of that information to make their project work wherever they are. And we found that that technology or that platform doesn't exist because it's currently, in terms of how technology and innovation is being utilized by the UN or Save the Children, it's from a certain perspective, it's from a certain cultural space. And really what it isn't looking at is letting go of your job and your career and not getting any money out of it. If you're looking to make money out of it and protect your organization, I think that's prohibitive. It's a mind block to creating a solution that doesn't have you in it. So in terms of our solution, we actually took ourselves out of it. We weren't thinking about, what will this solve for us? It was more that how can we make these projects work fundamentally better, not even better, just work. And that mindset, I think, is very difficult to get if you need an income or for your organization. It's quite a challenge. Or if you don't have some other sort of bank of money in stocks somewhere that can allow you to be really innovative and creative and not worry about getting in more funding.
Let's take some questions from some raised hands. Salim Dewoko. Salim, are you with us? I see that his image is frozen. So
oui, je suis là.
Okay.
Oui, je suis là.
Sorry, carry on.
Oui, en fait, ma question consiste à savoir, parce que je vois dans l'intervention de l'oratrice, c'est qu'elle a sorti vraiment des idées très intéressantes qui concernent le développement, c'est-à-dire des organisations. Son idée, si on voit bien, cette idée sort sur le fait que des organisations doivent compter sur leurs propres ressources, leurs propres revenus. Alors, ici, je vois, ça dépend des différents contextes du pays. Parce que dans les autres pays, il y a des dispositifs qui ont été pris par l'État. Et ces dispositifs favorisent en fait les organisations nouvelles qui sont créées. Et cet favorisme lui donne la possibilité de développer, c'est-à-dire ils ont par exemple, ils sont exonérés et cette exonération leur permet de développer. Alors malheureusement, je prends par exemple les cas comme la République centrafricaine. Alors si une organisation qui s'implante et il n'a pas vraiment de financement de l'extérieur, et moins encore, il n'a pas eu de l'exonération, et cette organisation ne peut pas du tout vraiment résister, ne serait-ce que même une année. Parce que le taxe qui viendrait vraiment frapper cette organisation va vraiment lui empêcher de progresser. En fait, si on voit bien dans son idéologie, il est très bien de penser sur l'évolution personnelle qui vient de l'organisation. Mais ça dépend du contexte du pays. Alors, pour le pays comme la République centrafricaine...
Salim, parce que, désolé de t'interrompre, mais comme je vais devoir traduire et c'est un long discours déjà, est-ce que vous pouvez arriver à la question pour faciliter l'échange?
Oui, la question. Comment peut-on faire pour les pays qui n'ont pas de dispositifs d'accompagnement des organisations de la société civile là, comment nous pouvons faire pour compter sur nos propres ressources ou pour générer nos propres ressources en dehors des financements extérieurs.
Ok, merci.
Ouais.
So Salim was coming back to the point, Ummul, that you were making about how organizations must to a certain extent rely on their own resources. And he said, depending on the country and the context, there are certain conditions created by the state that favor the survival of some organizations over others. And he was talking about in Central African Republic, specifically, a lot of organizations find it difficult to access external funding or funding at all, and a lot of organizations don't survive. So his question is, how do you foster that kind of support, especially for civil society organizations in countries where a lot of support doesn't exist? How can you create an environment in which CSOs can move in the direction of generating their own resources in order to avoid some of these traps that you've been talking about?
I find your question excellent, because this is exactly what we're doing in Syria. Bearing in mind that it's, I won't go into that too much, but we've faced all of these issues and probably very similar to yours. This is why one of the solutions we think is having a decentralized way of working, so that you can have local expertise choosing how to make those decisions on the ground, because it can look very different from town to town in terms of power structures, and country to country and community to community. So I think what we saw was that you can't have one solution that is imposed and then you sort of mirror it. Great, it worked in Bangladesh, let's go to the Central African Republic and do it there. We don't really have that mentality. So I think you can have a decentralized network where you can put resources into, and people can access those resources and also have direct control of their data. And that is possible to design and put out there. And then it means that the decisions of how you use those resources are local. At the moment, we are building on the fact that there is, billions of dollars available from the aid industry. We want to see more of that go locally, of course, but it needs to be controlled and decisions have to be made locally. And that's why the platform design is around that. And from our side, I think institutions in the West have to look at rescinding that control, but doing the due diligence over it, because we still have this whole due diligence and governments and paperwork, and that could be the responsibility on one side.
Thank you, Ummul. Let's take a comment. Theo, Theodile, I see that you've written quite an interesting comment in the chat. Would you be able to share that out loud with the participants?
Yes, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you so much, Ummul, for your awesome presentation. And I think the approach that your organization is putting forward is probably one of the way out, one of the way towards a fairer aid system. But my comment was that we've been criticizing the aid sector for at least 30 years, even more. And I think there are two ways of seeing things. One is to be very radical, like Dambisa Moyo, who said, you don't need to count on the aid sector at all. Just think about alternative ways of doing things. And the other approach is to try and change it from the inside. So if I was to suggest one thing, it would be to indeed insist on those local initiatives which may consist of finding alternative ways. And that's where I don't necessarily agree with Salim. Everywhere we are, we can find alternative funding approaches instead of still counting on the official aid sector, because my feeling is that it's very hard to try and change the aid sector. And I'm not sure you will succeed in doing that, because they have been trying to do that in 30 years. But instead, I think by bringing up, by relying on local initiatives, alternatives, having small systems like the one in Bangladesh, for example, with Mohammed, I forgot his family name. Those type of systems, from my point of view, are probably more viable than trying to change the big aid sector. Thank you.
Yeah. I think that's a great point, because I think we didn't also look at really the place of China. And I mentioned at the end about global remittances and how much more valuable that is than official aid sector. So I think there is space. But I think it's a different conversation to think about what could be done in terms of, accessing different finances. There's somebody else with a hand raised.
I see Amani Boami, you've had your hand raised for a little while. Do you want to ask a question or share a comment? We're having some trouble hearing you.
Emma, while we are sorting out this technical thing, maybe can I add something to what Trudy has just said? Yeah, I think actually there could be too many strategies to shift the system actually. So it also depends on your context and your own as an individual. What is your power for change? What is your power to act, and what can you do? So I don't think it's kind of white and black on black. It is much more what maybe for each of us to ask ourselves question is, what am I doing is trying to shift the system, and I know Umo, actually your point is like the small steps are not working. We need a kind of radical change, but then it is for each of us to just think about what can be the radical change I can make. And when it comes to civil society organizations, it is how can I change even that system when I'm working in a much more dependency. So how can I reduce even my dependency to that funding, to that system, and try to find alternatives? So I think it's all the whole purpose for today's topics, because there will be too many other topics about local fundraising, about how to build relation with communities we are serving, because most time even CSO lose kind of legitimacy in acting in the name of communities. So first it is like cleaning our house, trying to be strong organization. How are we investing in our own organization so that we can be strong and try to shift something? So I would say, please don't hesitate to join other sessions too, because they are bringing some other answers. And this session was bringing an angle, and there is too many other angles to look at during the day, and that's may help actually. So that was my only comment, Emma.
Thanks, Mireille. Let's try Amani again. Let's see if your sound is working. If it's not working, then I propose you add your question in the chat. So you'll try to unmute your microphone.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for presentation. My point was on when we are talking about big and huge organization and small organization. I mean, we should also understand that, I mean, the problem is not the organization. The problem is not the sector aid, the aid sector, but why we have so many NGOs, so many organizations in Africa. I'll be specific on Africa. It's because also the state or the government is weak. Because the government is weak, this is leave a huge place and huge decision place for these aid sectors. That's why in several countries, sometimes the NGOs, international or national or even a UN agency, they are doing many things that the government is not even able to stop them. When the government is not able to organize or to give to citizen capacity to respond, that will bring problem. So I think it's also, if you want to change things, we have to strengthen the government instead of thinking that NGOs or organization aid sector will reduce their way. If the government is more organized, so the aid sector will reduce its influence on the people, even on the community. So this is kind of relation we have in Africa, but also I want also to maybe to underline one thing. If you look in CAR, in Central African Republic, in Niger, in Mali, in several Africa countries that was colonized by some Western countries, when NGOs from this Western country are coming, you are still thinking some link on the history based. So this also puts the aid, the sector aid in a way where it's not only humanitarian we are doing. Sometimes look how embassies can influence NGOs. Look how donors, they can influence NGOs. Based on my experience, I've been in a local NGO, national, international, and in UN. So I know how the donors, they have power, how politically they can change even the ideology, the vision of international and these big NGOs. So we can have local initiatives that are good, but we need to have strengthened government. And when we are talking about nexus, we are talking about to strengthen capacity of the government. All these are theories. We know how they are coming. They are being with projects. And usually when you have big organization, they are doing copy paste. Even they will hide behind saying there is a need evaluation. It's copy paste. We did this in Haiti, you come and do it in Nigeria. So this is very, sometimes it's wrong even the what we are looking for. So you have human being is not again on the center of sector aids. So I mean it's more political than humanitarian. Over.
I would have to, that was the beginning of the talk, and I would have to agree with a lot of what you say, which is why, again, I would emphasize, we talked about the outside pressures. So if you think about the anti-racism movement, that's a huge, that is also within these international organizations. And it's a conversation that has to be a bit more open, as opposed to, you know, you're just bringing up, well, you're just saying I'm racist again. And I think we have to be a bit more that it feels actually very black and white. So if you speak, or if I have spoken over the last few years in a context where you're talking to local organizations, or, you know, even the language around it, beneficiaries, is like there's one idea there. And then if you talk to people who have career-orientated humanitarian aid jobs, they have a much slower way of thinking, and it has to be done step by step, and recognize there are a few problems. And I think that's why we need a revolution, because we're all saying the same thing, but it's not going to come from within the sector, and there has to be a passion. But, you know, I think these outside pressures, and with technology and the ability to have networks, you know, we can, because the great majority of people, the other side of it is, they do want to give this money to people who don't have as much. This money is available. It's just how is it being used that we have to change as part of the revolution.
Simone, let's take a question from Pierre Bellinga. If you could unmute your microphone.
Et je vous remercie. Je voudrais d'abord commencer par remercier Ummul Choudhury pour sa présentation. Je voudrais tout simplement apporter une petite contribution à sa présentation. Et cette contribution, elle est en rapport un peu avec un travail que je suis en train de faire actuellement sur une critique de l'aide internationale à partir d'un examen des fondements même de cette politique d'aide internationale. Il faudra noter ici que le système actuel de coopération internationale, sur sa base normative, poursuit une idée de justice globale. Nous le voyons dans tous les textes internationaux, dans toutes les déclarations des droits de l'homme et tous les textes des Nations Unies. C'est l'idée de justice globale qui est mise au devant. Mais malheureusement, derrière cette idée de justice, on s'est retrouvé dans un système global où pratiquement l'idée de l'aide internationale a été confondue à cette idée de justice internationale. Alors, le problème est le suivant. Dans les fondements de ce système international, on assiste à une sorte de séquençage des sociétés. Vous pouvez retrouver ce séquençage dans les textes d'un philosophe politique comme John Rawls, qui parle ici
Pierre, excuse-moi de vous interrompre.
De sociétés bien ordonnées.
Encore une fois, je vais vous demander d'être un peu concise parce qu'il va falloir que je fasse la traduction et on va encourager la discussion après. Alors, si vous pouvez essayer d'aller droit au but.
Oui, ici, je voudrais, ma contribution, c'est tend à dire que nous devons, si nous voulons révolutionner le système actuel de l'aide internationale, questionner les fondements qui nous ont conduits à ce système d'aide internationale. Et ces fondements, c'est le système inégal du système actuel de coopération internationale qui opère un séquençage entre des sociétés, entre guillemets, bien ordonnées, des sociétés entravées par des conditions défavorables, des sociétés hors la loi, comme on le retrouve dans les textes de John Rawls.
Ok, merci beaucoup. So Pierre was thanking you, Ummul, for your presentation. He is also working on a critique of international aid. And he said that the current system pursues an idea of global justice, but unfortunately behind this idea, international aid has been confused with global justice. And that if we want to revolutionize the system, we have to question its foundations, which is based on a system of inequality within the context of international cooperation.
Can I just say that listening to everybody's comments, it does feel like we're still at a revolution because there is this frustration with the current system and we are on repeat. And that is why I think we do need to look at other solutions that are not coming from organized. Obviously, we need to do advocacy within these organizations and campaign work. And this is why we actually have a sort of more than one tier approach. But this frustration, I think we create pressure. We're all living in a pressure cooker. And I think at some point it does explode. And if it's exploding through these other movements that we see happening outside, in the world at large, I think that will impact on our industry as well. And I'm very hopeful that if we can have a Google come up and change how we use information, then why can't we have sort of a decentralized way of making situations and decisions clear to the general public about what's happening in a war zone or an area of disaster?
One last question. I see that René, you have your hand raised. Ah, je vous entends, mais c'est de très loin.
Je dis que j'ai levé la main, j'ai des questions.
Oui, allez-y.
Tout d'abord, je tiens à remercier la conférencière, même si je comprends très difficilement l'anglais, mais ce n'est pas le problème. J'ai 3 petites questions. Ma première question, c'est de savoir comment percevez-vous le changement? C'est-à-dire que, parce qu'il faut d'abord, quand on arrive au niveau de cette thématique, il faut savoir comment on perçoit le changement dans nos organisations. Et ma deuxième question, est de savoir, est-ce que ce changement est-il toujours comme étant la solution à nos problèmes, ou bien il vient encore aggraver encore les situations qui existent? Et la troisième question, j'ai suivi, il y a eu un certain nombre d'éléments qu'on a essayé de énumérer, mais moi, je veux un peu savoir, est-ce que la pauvreté, la corruption, l'exclusion sociale ne constituent pas, en quelque sorte, les modèles ou bien les moteurs qui poussent au moins ces organisations-là à aller vers un changement? Souvent, c'est ce qui se caractérise en Afrique. Et ma toute dernière question, si je voulais que la communicatrice nous partage un peu les limites, les contraintes, les défis de la plateforme. Et ce partage-là serait quand même un peu profitable pour nous pour savoir dans quelle mesure on peut aussi capitaliser cela. Merci.
Okay. René asked several questions. I'm going to start with a couple and we'll see how far we get considering we only have a few minutes left. The last one being, can you talk a bit more about the limits, constraints, and challenges of the kinds of networks that you propose needing to be at the forefront of the aid effort and aid movements? Let's start with that one.
So in terms, so I'm going to take from a technological perspective. So we do have a system where we have to do a massive amount of so if you think about, for example, practically money transfers, how do you transfer money into areas that are designated as, you know, war zones or terrorist enclaves, and that money, how do you get it there? You know, so I think in terms of, and it can, that situation can differentiate from area to area. And in terms of having a local network or local information, you can use technology. There are new solutions available. For example, we could have a digital money to track how funds are sent. That is perfectly feasible. I think there has to be a will to do it, but there are ways to do it. And that would then fulfill sort of governance and due diligence requirements about understanding where that money is going and how it's being used. And I think as well, we have to have a trust-based network at a local level, which uses technology to ensure that data is coming out, concrete data, so we can realize these due diligence requirements. At the end of the day, we have a system where if we do want money from the West, that money is going to be looked at with a magnifying glass. And I think you need technological solutions to create a trust-based system at a decentralized level. There's a lot of challenges around it because it requires not one party, but many. But I think these things are feasible if you get, because the technology is available, and as the technology develops, it's actually easier and easier to use, to make use of it for our sector.
Thanks very much, Ummul. I'm afraid that we are going to have to stop there as our session is coming to a close. But before we leave, Ummul, is there anything that you wanted to talk about in terms of other things that you're working on? I know that you mentioned that you have a book coming out. Any information that you want to share with participants before we wrap up?
Yep, firstly, thank you so much for taking part. I always find it fascinating how much more I have to learn, however long I'm in this space. And I'm really glad to be learning all the time to make our solutions better and stronger for everybody. Because if we're in a position to speak, I do believe we should be speaking. Even if we don't do it so well or do it great, we should be speaking and doing something. And it starts with us, as Muriel said. I think it starts with individual. In terms of resources, yes, I do have a book coming out, United Nonsense. And it is talking about how to do this revolution in the aid sector, but it's also a story. So I'm using a storytelling about what we've been through, because there aren't really that many stories out there that encompass and include a critique. I'd really like to share any resources, and so I will share those with you, Emma, and perhaps the group can access them later. If anyone has any questions, please feel free about my talk or anything else, just to come back. We're on social media as well as through the Innovation for Change social media. So you can look for us there, but I'd be happy to share any resources, have any comments. Please do follow us at United Nonsense. I think is kind of I think United Nonsense kind of encompasses how I feel without being too aggressive or without being, what is it? Like, I don't know if, I'm sure people know about the Charter for Change and the Grand Bargain, but it just doesn't sound sort of sexy enough. And I want to say United Nonsense. So I'm going to give it a little bit of a punch, but still being in there that you would talk to me. So please do follow us there.
Well, thank you very much for your time and for your presentation. Thank you everyone for your time as well. We will be making any information about Ummul's session and additional resources available on our Facebook group and LinkedIn. And in 15 minutes, we'll have our next session starting. It's a roundtable on how can African civil society organizations strengthen their financial sustainability. And we have more talks today on thinking about models of civil society funding. So if you are interested, please do join us in the other sessions. Thank you again, everyone, and have a great day.
Merci Emma, et merci Corinne pour la traduction.
Thank you, Ummul.
Thank you, Ummul. See you later.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.